Cool. Raise your hand if you can hear me. Can you guys hear me in the back corner? Can Sebastian hear me? Is he with me? Great. Dan, take it easy. Okay, so today we're all right. Whenever we say revolution in history, you have to understand a lot of times you get the impression a revolution is something that occurs very, very quickly, and that is true. But often when the historians do this thing where they looking back, it looks like it happened very quickly, but a lot of cases it might not have happened quickly. This scientific revolution, nobody living in it was like, I'm going through the scientific revolution. Isn't this amazing? So you have to keep that in mind. This took a long period of time. There was a lot of stuff that came before it that set it up, but it makes the world the way that it is today. When you look at the way people learn things or believe that they know things, science is absolutely essential to that today. When people argue in a legitimate way, they often use science to back up what they're saying, sometimes. And even when it comes to very seemingly controversial topics that are in politics today, nobody would, most people in American politics would say that if science indicates something, that's what's true. Now, it's important to keep in mind when we talk about science, there's an important thing to keep that I wish I'd known when I was younger learning about science. Number one, science is not designed to prove things. What science does is it comes up with a model that explains how the world works. It's designed to give us a way of predicting things so that we can use that science in a useful way. But science, does it prove things? Sort of. But a scientist doesn't work in trying to prove something as trying to come up with the best model, which leads to the second important thing to understand about science. Often you'll hear people say that the scientists are changing their minds. That's kind of like saying that, as you are as a teenager, you should think the same way when you get older. You gain experience, you gain new opportunities, and you do things differently than when you were a kid. Science works the same way. And what scientists do in many cases, the way that a scientist makes their mark is by trying to prove other scientists wrong and coming up with a better model. And so that's when people say, well, scientists used to think that they don't know anything. Science is probably the best model we have for learning about complex things. Does it change? In some ways it does, but it's important to keep in mind. This isn't because the method doesn't work. It's because our data gets better, our tools for measuring things get better. That's how science works. So this is the very beginning of science. We're going to talk about, now the important thing here is that people are not only changing, it's not that like people all of a sudden weren't like dumb and they were like, oh, I know science. Their tools got better. Their ways of thinking about things got better. And that thing that started in the Renaissance about having a sort of secularism many people began to think that it was okay to examine the world in a way that was like breaking it down, analytical. Whereas before, where in many cases, I'm not knocking the churches and religion here, but many people often thought at that time that it was a bad thing to examine the universe because God had made it and you shouldn't question it. But that idea started to change, and that kind of opened up too. So the scientific revolution changed the way people thought about the universe knowledge and how people could get that knowledge. Now, important to understand, this isn't everybody. Not everybody's like, whoa, now I know science. No, this is going to be gradually. At first, it's a very small group of people, but now it gets to the point where, you, for instance, when you get sick, you go see a medical professional, hopefully. You see a medical professional because you believe that when you get sick, it's because you have germs. If you use hand sanitizer, it's believed because there's tiny little living things that you have never, ever seen unless it's under a microscope. But even then, maybe you could be fooled. But little germs, that's what causes this. You know that because of science. But right up, that theory about germs doesn't originate until about 150 years from today ago. So people lived in some different times. Anyway. Long story short, let's talk about some of the early thinkers. So in the Middle Ages, scientists often used ancient thinkers for how they believed the world worked. So these thinkers would go back to the old texts, Greek and Roman texts. Aristotle was one of the big ones. Aristotle had some different ideas about how the way the world was structured, the way things worked. he also believed that slavery was a natural thing. So, this was the good with the bad they took, but he believed that, that it was obvious to people that some people were not as, intelligent or smart and things like that. Then you had Ptolemy. Ptolemy did a lot of thinking about the way that the universe was structured. These were the traditions that they had going into the Middle Ages, Aristotle. So they basically looked at what Aristotle had written and said, man, the guy was really smart. We don't need to challenge his way of thinking. It makes sense. Yeah, that's not scientific. Okay. Anybody who thinks that scientists are, science is about challenging constantly. Okay. But that's not science. But that's a little bit of background. But new thinkers got some ideas and some new tools that help them challenge some of the old ways of thinking. Measuring is important here. Science, to be able to conduct science, you really have to be able to measure things. It really all depends what you want to measure too. And scientists are constantly thinking ways. Make sure you turn to the notes, okay? Are constantly trying to figure out new ways to measure things. So what do you get? And again, it wasn't that people were stupid. They just got better tools. For instance, the telescope lets you see a lot further than you could if you didn't have one, than just looking. And so people started to, if you can look at the moon or planets, you can really get a level of detail that tells you, man, that thing, maybe it's not like a floating orb of energy. Maybe it looks like it's made of rocks. They get the microscope, which allows them to examine smaller and smaller things and see how they work. And finally, you get the printing press. We've talked about this before, but the fact that scientists can publish their ideas, spread them around, and allow others to either challenge them or back them up is important. Mathematics also was something that people began to believe you could basically describe lots of things using math. You could almost describe anything, they thought. Okay, let's talk about astronomy. So this is a famous one. This is if you want to talk about how people's knowledge about the way that the universe is changed, you can talk about astronomy. All right, so the thinker before Ptolemy had this idea about how the universe was structured. But so it seems obvious, when you're born as a little baby, you don't think that you're constantly moving. All right, we don't feel like, anybody feel like you're moving right now? Like feel? No, you feel motionless. Okay, I'm sitting here I am. But the reality is that relative to the sun, the Earth is traveling at thousands of miles an hour, right? But you don't feel that, you don't know it. So people felt like the Earth was at the center. The Earth seems to be set in its place. They occasionally may have used religious verses to back this up. There's a Bible verse, I don't know where it is, but it talks about, that God sets the earth in its place. And so they said, well, that's what it means. The earth doesn't move, everything else goes around it. The other heavenly bodies, the sun, all the planets that they could see, they couldn't see out past Saturn. They didn't know about some of the other planets that were out there. And the stars, they had this sense that the stars were a big sphere outside of everything, and that God was outside of this, and God caused these things to move. This was called the geocentric universe. Geo meaning Earth at the center. They had to come up with some pretty complicated ways of figuring out some different things. For instance, this is something we're usually not in touch with, but I want to show you what it would look like. And this was complicated. This is where the word planets get their name. The word comes from, is a Greek word, and it means a wanderer. So this is why the people said that the planets were wanderers. It's because if you were to observe them from night to night and chart where they were, and you could keep it against the background of the stars, what you would see are the planets would make this sort of strange motion. I don't know if I have it right, but you would see the planet from go here, first night, second night, third night, fourth night, fifth night, sixth night, seventh night, eighth night. It would change motion, go this way, back, and then continue this way. So they had to figure out, okay, well, why does that happen? Why do these planets seem to sort of move on their own and change direction on their own? Why does it happen? So they had to come up with some pretty complicated explanations. This one shows why it actually does. I hope this video works. Enjoy. Let's see if they get to the part that I'm talking about. Okay, so you know that's how the blue one's the Earth, the red one's Mars, the yellow one is the sun. You know that's basically what it looks like, although it's not to scale, it's not elliptical, yada yada. Okay, let's see if they actually show what it would look like. I hope they do, otherwise I've wasted 2 minutes. Oh yeah, they are going to show it. This is what it would look like from a standpoint on the Earth if you watch this from night to night. If you could plot it, this is exactly what the motion would look like. So those thinkers had to explain why this would happen. Why would something move? And they came up with all these sorts of crazy different things, and it was really quite complicated and not true. But that was the best information they had and the best of technology that they had. Where the heck is it? Where did I put it? Okay. Would explain that movement of the planets explained the so-called movement of the star that known as the star that was supposed to be involved in activity. Oh, okay. It could be too, yeah. So, okay. So, what comes next? The so-called heliocentric universe. Now, important to understand, they still think that they're going to say the heliocentrists are going to say now the sun's at the center, everything else revolves around the sun, and but the sun is at the center of what they still consider to be the universe. We now know that the universe is massive. The solar system, the sun is at the center, but our solar system is just a tiny little one set up in a whole other kind of setup. I think I got a YouTube clip playing there still. Sorry. My viewers are, there we go. So the heliocentric universe, because of different measurements they can make, better tools and computations, Nicholas Copernicus is the one that develops this initial idea that the sun is at the center and, you know, the different planets revolve around the sun. Now, later they had to develop, you know, why some different things happened, like, you know, some other more scientific-y stuff. And they figured out that the orbits of the planets were also elliptical, but not circular. The initial thought was that they were circular. They tend to be ellipses. Get a little jammed up here. So these ideas, we've all heard about Galileo. We'll hear about him in a second. These ideas were a little bit sort of like controversial at the time. And what happened in many circles, religious circles, especially with the Catholic Church, but also with the Protestant Church, but the Catholic Church has a lot of power, is that this was sort of frightening because this seemed to the Catholic Church to contradict the Bible. The Bible, you know, said that God set the earth on its foundations and things like that. So they began to get a little bit worried that if people could challenge these ideas, they might challenge other church ideas. Now, the first guys that wrote about this, Kepler and Copernicus, this was mostly like scientific writing, so the regular person didn't write it. And Galileo was the guy who took this information about the universe or the solar system and began to put it in a way that regular people could read and understand. He wrote this book that was basically like a dialogue between two people talking about how the sun was at the center of the solar system and not the earth. He come up with other things. He used a telescope to observe the moon. He saw that the moon had mountains, that there were moons around Jupiter. He observed sunspots, which were things on the sun that, you know, are different patches of things that I don't understand. People used to think that the planets were made of pure light. They were just sort of these floaty orbs of light. He was able to discover, because, you know, you've seen pictures of Jupiter and you know it's not, but you wouldn't have those pictures if it wasn't for good technology. So he publishes this book, and that's what gets him in trouble with the church. They force him to take back what he was saying about his views on the universe. It was dangerous not because he said it, but because he published it to regular people. And it was written in Italian, and so people could read it, and that was kind of scary to the church at the time. Okay, Isaac Newton. This guy was apparently like a total jerk to people. But anyway, great thinker. Developed calculus all by himself. Anybody taking algebra in here now? All right, and calculus is harder. And he basically invented it. I mean, that's what he did. This is how brilliant this guy was. That's hard enough to figure out on your own with a teacher. Imagine coming up with it yourself. He also is the guy that we're famous for an apple dropping on his head and gravity and things like that. And he's the one that really develops this idea of gravity. And this thinking that the world is governed by different mechanical forces begins to give people the idea that you could discover what's going on with things. That it wasn't that sort of, as some people might have thought, God just makes everything happen the way he wants it. But there are certain things that you could do experiments and you could figure out why gravity occurs, or even what the pull of gravity is, which maybe you've probably learned in physics. Okay, there were women in modern science, but they're really kind of trying to get their foot in the door on this one. But for the most part, they aren't allowed in. It's considered a boys' club. And you have to understand, for scientists then, these aren't people that are like they go and they major in science or they're taking science classes. They're independent thinkers. So to even get that level of education, women typically in a sexist way weren't, often offered that. But it did happen. Margaret Cavendish wrote books on scientific matters, including philosophy. In Germany, there were many women who were involved in astronomy. Maria Winkelmann even discovered her own comet, but she still wasn't allowed to be in the Berlin Academy because she wasn't allowed to be a woman. What goes hand in hand with the new ideas that they're going to have about reason, logic versus feeling and intuition, was that women were naturally not as reasonable as men. So that's why one of the reasons women were held back. Okay, let's talk about this guy, Descartes. Descartes did a little bit with, actually, let's all take a little stand-up break. Go ahead, everybody, stand. And sit back down. Okay, Descartes wanted to figure out, he was what we call a philosopher. Now, the modern day picture we have of a philosopher is a guy, probably a white dude, probably with a pipe, sitting in his study going, that's interesting, or something. But philosophers in that early time thought about a lot of different things. Make sure you're taking notes, guys. And what they thought about, philosophers didn't just think about things that were strange and weird. They thought about the way the universe was structured. You taking notes, Luke? Okay, so here's a great example. One of the things that philosophers do is they have something that's called, oh crap, I forgot the name. It'll come to me. But there's a branch of philosophy that wants to, what the question is basically, how do we know things and how do we know that we know things? And so this was kind of what Descartes wanted to do. He wanted to start with, he wanted to give up old traditions about how we know what we know. And he wanted to start with this. Okay, how do I know things? He's like, okay, so he wanted to doubt everything possible and then build up from the ground up and see how is it that we know things. What he did was he said, okay, let me start with the thing that seems most obvious to me, that I exist. How do I know that I exist? All right, this is getting a little trippy. So he basically said to himself, well, even if I doubt my own existence, even if I say to myself, I probably don't exist, there has to be something there to do the doubting. So in the act of saying, I don't exist, you must exist. So he started with that. That's what he's famous for. I think, therefore I am. He built up off of that. He wasn't somebody that thought we can't know anything, but he began to develop it. Epistemology, that's what it is. Epistemology is the study of knowing what we know. So he also came up with this idea of the mind and body being separate, which turns out to not be true. The mind seems to be totally dependent upon the brain, because if you don't have a brain, you don't have a mind. But he came up with this idea that they were separate in some way, and so that matter was dead and you could investigate it. So learning more about biology and things like that. So that's Descartes. Then there was Francis Bacon, who was, he believed that instead of relying on ancient ideas, tradition, people should use inductive reasoning to learn about nature. What does that mean? You start from very small observations. Very small experiment. For instance, you could, if you were experimenting with gravity or something like that, you could drop something. And this was obvious to everybody, but there's other ways of doing this. But inductive reasoning is take a small sample of something and get a bigger conclusion from it. And this is kind of what scientists do. They begin to develop the scientific method at that time. And that only comes from practice and experimentation. So the scientific method works that way. It's important to understand when someone tries to take something that science has sort of given us a better idea about and says, well, I don't know why you trust the scientists. They change their minds all the time anyway. That's what science is supposed to do. The information gets better and better all the time. At least that's the hope. If we can measure things better, we can understand them better. But don't let anybody tell you that scientists are, changing their minds. They get better information, and that's how science works. Cool. Way to hang in there. Let's get these questions done. How many questions are there? 4. Let's take 5 minutes. Get ready for those questions. Go. Dan, you don't need to sing every time.